Okay, morning everybody. So we're continuing our Greek discussion. Leilani has asked us about the accenting in something she was looking at. So let me quickly try to share with you some of the rules of accenting. Accenting can be a huge extra burden, something more to remember. Okay, so I want to share that. I want to share a Word document that has the accenting rules explained quickly. And I'll run through them in a hurry. So these are the rules. The acute accent can stand on any of the last 3 syllables, the circumflex only on the last 2, and the grave can only stand on the last syllable. The circumflex can never be on a short syllable. That's fairly easy up to that point. If the last syllable is long, the accent must fall on one of the last 2 syllables. You'll see a lot of that forms where the final syllable changes from short to long. You'll sometimes have to move the accent forward if it stood on the 3rd last syllable originally. If the last syllable has the accent, it must be an acute. That is, if it is long. So if the last syllable is long, the accent must be on one of the last 2. And if it's on the last, called the ultima, it must be acute. In other words, if the final syllable is long, the second last syllable never takes a circumflex. If the final syllable is long, the accent happens to belong to the second last syllable with a long vowel, then the accent must be the circumflex. Sounds like a contradiction. Yep, there is a contradiction. I've done something wrong there. So if the final syllable is long, it may have either an acute or a circumflex. An acute accent on the final syllable of a word changes to a grave if the word is not followed by a punctuation mark. And the accent on verbs moves as close to the beginning of the word as the general rules allow, whereas in nouns, it stays on the same syllable on which it falls in the lexical form, again, as closely as the general rules will allow. To be honest, Leilani, I almost always have to double check my accenting. So whenever I'm drawing up these little Greek things, I'll follow a hunch and then I'll go and look up a form somewhere just to double check it. I'll share those. As soon as I find out the contradiction, I'll try and share those rules with you. Have we missed anybody here? Gerson's not joining us this morning. Ryan is not yet here. What says Sue, Andreas?
I'm doing okay. I'm a little frazzled. Late because I had to grab coffee first.
Yeah, coffee is important. Oh, come on, man. Now, why am I not getting an option? There we go, to invite. Okay, I would like to get a read on how far along we are as a group. Just what chapter you are, not as a test or anything, just so that I know more or less how far through this everyone is. So if I could just ask you all just to tell me where you're at with mounts and the workbook, assuming they're probably in corresponding chapters, that would be helpful. Yeah, so let's start.
So I've gone on to, I'm all the way up to chapter 21 in terms of reading and following along, but I don't even know, I think I'm 18 in terms of exercises.
Okay, all right. So theory 18, practice 20. Other way around. Theory 21, practice 18. Yeah.
Yes.
Books you did tell me, but just remind me.
Theory, I'm in chapter 20. I think I've basically completed chapter 20, but exercises, I've just finished 17.
Estelle?
Good morning, Kevin.
Goeiemôre in die Kaap.
Ja, dit is baie goeiemôre in die Kaap. I started chapter 20 and I realized that I needed to go right back to 18. So I restudied chapter 18 and 19. So I'm busy with the exercises of chapter 19 and busy with reading chapter 20.
Thank you. Gary? All right, come back to you, Gary. I can't hear you at the moment. Marilyn?
I'm probably pretty much where Bix is. I'm reading chapter 20, but I'm on exercise 17, and that's because I keep having to go back and reread all the chapters because the words just aren't sinking in.
Vocabulary, you've mentioned that's been your challenge before.
I think my brain has reached capacity and it just doesn't want to soak anything more in.
Your brain capacity? I doubt it very much.
I don't know. I think maybe it's because I'm focusing on my thesis this term because I have to get it finished before the end of the year. So Greek has sort of taken a little bit of a back seat, so it doesn't get as much attention. So once I've got this thesis out the way, then I can refocus on Greek.
Katalambano. Gary, can you speak? Can you hear? I see you've unmuted your mic. We're still not hearing you, so I assume that's a microphone problem. Well, I'm not hearing you. Anybody else hearing Gary?
Oop.
Uka Kwaman se, Gary. Uka Kwaman se. All right, here. So the general picture is probably somewhere around about chapter 20 in terms of reading through Mounts, but most folk are a bit behind that when it comes to keeping up with the exercises. And pardoning my lagging here. All right, so let's just throw open the invitation to ask whatever you want to ask. I haven't prepared anything formal. I have just uploaded this morning a new conversation for Mounts chapter 20, which uses predominantly the vocabulary and grammar in Mounts 20. You'll notice the last few that I've uploaded, 16, 18, 19, and 20. I've tried to base the vocabulary and grammar directly on the chapter. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of reinforcing the vocabulary and grammar covered in that chapter. And if you are struggling with elements of the chapter, it might be a good thing to download the audios of the conversations and just try and listen to them when in transit or when you've got dead time, because they are now based very closely on the theory that's covered in the corresponding chapter of Mounts. My hope is to revamp all of the conversations to overlap or relate to the theory covered in the relevant chapter of Mounts. Questions? Where are you struggling? Anything that's particularly unclear?
Kevin, thanks for those conversations, because to me, memory-wise is my biggest challenge. The understanding is not too bad, but memorizing, especially now with the roots being added as well, understanding where the roots comes from to memorize that. But the conversations really help, and those picture stories that you're doing is really excellent. To me, between those two, they help really very much with memorization.
Okay, thank you. Good to know. Any other comments? If there's nothing particular, or particularly related to the unit in question, what I will do is just revert to a story, and we'll use it as practice for the morning, but I'm happy to take questions if you have any.
Kevin, I have a bit of an off-the-wall question, if you don't mind trying. I was trying to look. A couple of weeks, I've been working through Mark, and a couple of weeks back I came across a story, and in English it swapped between he, his, him, and it was between Jesus and someone else. And in English it was very difficult to know who the he was actually referring to at times. You know, depending on trying to use context, obviously helped us and things like that. I was just wondering, does Greek provide any advantage in that aspect, in the whole accusative?
Can you remember the passage?
I'm trying to find the passage because that obviously it would be a lot more helpful if I could actually read the example, but now I can't remember exactly which one it was.
The purely theoretical answer is yes. Greek would remove a fair amount of the ambiguity, but it would depend somewhat on the context and the particular case that you're dealing with. The fact that Greek has a tendency to decline words will often remove ambiguity.
Okay.
And will certainly remove ambiguity where the pronouns are explicit. There will be less ambiguity than where the pronouns are not. So if the pronoun's embedded in the noun, you've got the same tendency for ambiguity as in English.
Okay.
But to answer you, it would be really helpful if you could.
I'll scan and see if I can pick it up as we go, and maybe touch it again at the end.
Okay. All right. That'll be good.
Thank you.
Okay. So it always helps to practice. A nice way to practice is through these stories. So I'm going to share my screen in a few seconds, and we will practice with the conversation or the story of Jesus being tempted. I did this with the 1A class the other day. So it's going to be something of a rehash of familiar terminology, but I don't think that's ever wasted, actually. And some of it probably won't be familiar. Why do I have that? Resume slideshow. Okay, you should be seeing a PowerPoint.
No.
No.
Blepete PowerPoint. Carlos.
No, blepo.
Carlos. All right, so that yellow ball is called Helios. Helios, from which we derive our English word helium. Helios. Kalimera Ryan. I gather you're struggling to find the invites. I did send you a few, so I'm not sure how we get around that. But nice to have you here. Helios. And prosjuchetai ho Jesus katalamanete. Estelle? Ti hermenue prosjuchetai ho Jesus?
Jesus is praying.
Nai. Prosjuchetai ho Jesus. Prosjuchetai ente remo. Ho Jesus? Prosjuchetai ente heremo. He's praying in the desert. Why don't you mute your mic, Estelle?
Leilani.
Oh, Leilani, my apologies. I'm hearing a lady's voice. No problem. Hearing a lady's voice. Estin ente eremo. Ente eremo. Notice, by the way, that eremos is feminine, even though it's first declension. So it's got a masculine look about it. but it is in fact a feminine word. Estin en terremo. So let me ask you some questions about this. Pu estin ho Jesus? Marilyn, pu estin ho Jesus? Catalambanes pu?
I think so. You're asking me, what is he doing?
Pu.
Okay.
Pu. Asking you where.
Oh, where? Okay.
Where, whenever you hear that there's poo around, you should wonder where it is.
Where? Yes. Okay.
Pu estin ho Jesus?
O Jesus en te eremo.
Eremo, en terremo, Eucharisto. Kai tipoie. Tipoie. Tipoie ho Jesus.
Prosjugetai ho Jesus.
Pros Euchetai. Ho Jesus pros Euchetai. Pros Euche, Marilyn? Pros Euche? Nun? Pros Euche nun?
Ook prosjugomai.
Kalos.
But
Kalos.
be.
Estin orthon. You got it right. U pros Euchomai. I am not praying. I asked, are you praying now? Nun pros Euche. Okay, so this ho diabolos. Ergetai pros Jesun, ho diabolos. Ergetai pros Jesun. Ho diabolos ege lithon. Ti hermenue lithon, books? Ti hermenue lithon?
Lithon is a stone.
Nai, estin orthon. Lithon, ege lithon, ka ege alon lithon. Alon lithon. O diabolos, ege lithon, ka ege alon lithon. Ege, o diabolos, duo lithus. Ege duo lithus. Ti hermenue, ege duo lithus. Can you guess, Andreas? Ege duo lithus. O diabolos, ege duo
But
lithus.
I must admit, I'm a little bit lost here. So
Okay.
two stones, but I'm missing the words before that, I think.
Ege, he has.
Okay.
O diabolos, ege lithon, he has a stone.
Yeah.
Ege alon, another.
Oh,
Ege
another, that's right. Okay, there we go.
alon lithon.
Okay, and then that results in two. Okay.
Nai. Hutos, thus, ege duo lithus. And when we go to 2, of course, it changes to plural. So, ege lithon, ege lithus. Lithon, lithus. O diabolos, ergetai pros Jesun, kai ege duo lithus, kai peraze ton Jesun. Peraze, he tempts Jesus. The Greek word for tempting and testing is one and the same. So there are some passages where, because the word temptation in English has a distinctly moral overtone, to test in terms of ethics and morality. But the word in Greek is the same for tempting and testing, whether it's moral or some other. Peraze ton Jesun ho diabolos. Tipoie ho diabolos, Leilani.
O diabolos poie duo lethus.
Ha diabolos eche duolithus. So if I asked you, ti eche ha diabolos, what does he have? Then your answer would be eche duolithus. I asked you, ti poie, catalambanes poie?
O diabolos pera zei ton Iesun.
Nai, peraze ton Iesun. What is he doing? Ti poie, what is he doing? Peraze ton Iesun. He is tempting ton Iesun. Ton Iesun. And if I asked you, tis ergetai pros Iesun? Tis? Ti hermenue tis, Bux?
Sorry, repeat that, Kevin.
Tis ergetai pros Iesun. Tis ergetai pros Iesun.
Diabolos perazaiton Iesun.
Ha diabolos peraze ton Iesun. That's what he's doing. The word tis means who, and the word ti, which is simply the neuter form of the same word, means what or why.
Yes.
So if I ask you ti poie, it's what is he doing? If it's tis, it's a who question. So I asked, tis ergetai pros Iesun. So your answer should be ha diabolos.
Yeah.
Catalambanete?
Catalambanite, Eucharista.
Tis ergetai pros Iesun, ha diabolos. Ti poie ha diabolos. What is he doing? Peraze ton Iesun. Peraze ton Iesun. Marilyn, peraze se ha diabolos? Peraze se?
Oh, it depends. I'm trying to think how to answer that.
Nai e uk.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to think. I think it's nai pareze o diabolos me. I don't know about that word order.
Word order is not terribly important. Peraze ha diabolos su. Se. So you would simply say, nai, yes. Peraze ha diabolos me. Yes, the devil tempts or tests me.
Yeah, that one.
Okay, now notice the subtlety here. In our picture, when we read peraze ha diabolos ton Iesun, you get the sense that the testing or the tempting means the devil is tempting Jesus, right? In other words, the sense of the present tense is he is currently busy testing or tempting Jesus. So it's this continuous action in the present moment. Peraze ton Iesun, he's testing Jesus. In much the same way as I am teaching you. If I said didasko mas, right at this moment, because we're in the midst of an ongoing lesson, didasko humas, I am teaching you is this continuous action in the moment. But when I turn that to the question, peraze ha diabolos se, Marilyn, or if I asked everyone as a group, peraze ha diabolos humas, catalambanete, peraze ha diabolos humas, the devil tempts you, question. The question is not so much now, is he tempting you at this precise moment, but does the devil tempt you? Can you sense that difference? He is busy tempting Jesus in our picture, peraze ton Iesun, Peraze me, he tempts me, still present tense, but I'm not saying necessarily he's doing it at this precise moment. There's more of a general sense that he does tempt me. Nai peraze me. Yes, he does tempt me. In Greek, the present tense does duty for both of those senses. The one is something that's busy happening and unfolding in the moment, and the other one is more of a general customary statement. Yes, he tempts me, even though it may not be at this precise moment. We would tend to use different helping words in English to convey those two ideas. So in English, in my picture, I would translate the devil is tempting Jesus, not the devil tempts Jesus, because tempts would imply more of the general customary sense. But when I ask Marilyn, peraze ho diabolos se? And she answers, nai, peraze me. It's, does the devil tempt you? Yes, the devil tempts me. Not necessarily limiting that to the moment. Does that make sense?
It kind of makes sense, but if I had been asked the question instead of Marilyn, I was going to answer no, not at the moment. So how do you convey then the difference between are you being tempted and are you tempted?
The only way you could do that was through paying attention to context. The grammar alone will not distinguish those two. Greek would have the capacity to add helping words that would clarify the sense. So if I asked you, Andreas, peraze nun ho diabolos se? I add the word now. Is the devil now tempting you?
Okay.
Peraze nun? Then you immediately get the sense that the answer is u peraze me nun. No, he's not tempting me now. Allah peraze me, but he does tempt me.
Okay.
So you can always add contextual terms that would make clear which of the senses is meant. Normally context will make clear, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we can look at something and say, is this saying it's happening at the moment, or is it saying it happens regularly, repeatedly, or even generally? Sometimes interpretive decisions hang on how we read that sort of thing in a particular context.
Okay, thank you.
What's important to note here, by the way, just anchoring off this discussion, is the popular fallacy that Greek is more precise than English is exactly that. It's a fallacy. It would be correct to say that certain features of Greek grammar would have more specific nuances than English counterparts. But the same also happens in reverse. So what we have in effect here is one Greek tense, the present tense, doing duty for more meanings than one particular form would do in English present. So in English we've got a present continuous and a simple present. Is tempting, tempts. The Greek present tense has to do both of those duties. So in this case, in this feature of the language, English has two tense forms that map onto one Greek tense form. So in this sense, Greek has more ambiguity because the context has to disambiguate which of those two functions of the present tense is in focus. In other features, Greek will be more precise, and that would permeate the language. So the popular fallacy, and it's normally sprouted by those who don't know too much about the language, the popular fallacy that Greek was a more precise language is precisely that. It's a fallacy, and I think that holds true across languages. So all languages have areas in which they are more precise and less precise. So there are pros and cons. And it's good to debunk that fallacy. So peraze ton Jesun ho diabolos in our picture.
Kevin? Sorry, Kevin.
Yes, somebody asking
a question quickly? Yeah, it's Ryan.
Go
Kevin,
for it,
I'm just
Ryan.
wondering, is that aspect that you're describing now?
Yes.
Okay.
Verbal
and then
aspect.
What are those two? What are the technical terms for those two different kinds of aspect?
It depends on whose book you're reading. A commonly used term in grammatical books would be to describe once-off action as punctilia, and repeated action takes different forms in different contexts, and so would have different words used. Continuous would be continuous in the present time. So in that moment, the devil is tempting Jesus. That's continuous in the present time. But continuing action sometimes has more of a sense of repetition. So if I said, hamartano, I sin, hamartano, I sin, it doesn't mean that I sin continually, as in at every moment of every day I'm continually sinning. It also doesn't mean hamartano, I am busy sinning at the present moment. At least not necessarily. It could if I was busy doing something at the moment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. If I just make the statement about myself, hamartano, I sin, what am I saying? I'm saying, in some sense, I sin repeatedly or periodically or even habitually. All of those nuances are carried in Greek by a present tense. In English, the technical terms are simple present and continuous present. But grammarians do use different words in Greek. They tend mostly to distinguish some sense of repetition, which would be defined as continuous or ongoing action, from once-off type of action, which would be a particular event, and that's punctilia. So the irony here is, if we take this slide that we're looking at, peraze ton Iesun, he is tempting Jesus, it's a single act of temptation. It's not ongoing, continuous, repetitive, beyond the moment. It's a single act or a series of acts that are unfolding in the moment. That's a long answer because I'm not sure what the right answer is.
Sorry, Kevin.
No, thanks, that helps.
Kevin?
Andrew, I can hear you. Can you go ahead?
Sorry, I had a blank here. Okay, sorry. So you said when you say I sin, it contains this idea that it happens not necessarily right now, but how much is that based on the language and not based on just what we understand about sin? Because if I say I sit, you don't get the idea that at some point in a continuous time I tend to sit. You would understand that I am right now on a seat.
So you would take it as I am sitting.
Okay, so it would be the way I phrase the...
So the reality here is that language doesn't stand alone. Any language. What language does is to give evidence of somebody's communicative intentions. The language doesn't convey the entire message. I don't know if I've ever used this example with you as a class, but let me use it anyway. Imagine you work at Checkers, and your job inter alia is to lock up. So you're standing by the main entrance to the Checkers store. Your store closes at 5 p.m. It's 4:58, and I walk up to the door. And you say to me, we close at 5. What are you really saying?
We're about to close.
We're about to close? Now I'm going to infer what you're trying to say, which is not necessarily the exact meaning of the words. So it could mean hurry up, because I want to go home. It could mean go away. We don't want new customers now. But if you and I were friends and we had an arrangement that we were going to have a game of squash as soon as you finished work, your meaning suddenly changes dramatically to, I'm nearly done, I'll be with you in a few moments. So the same words giving evidence of different communicative intentions is heavily context dependent. So if you say in Greek, kathemai, I'm sitting, or I sit, there would be something in the context that would need to help me to understand that you mean at the moment I'm sitting. So if I had just asked you, are you standing, and you said, kathemai, no, I'm sitting, it would be fairly clear. But if we took the statement kathetai ho Jesus epiton thronon autou, Jesus sits on his throne, entus uranus, in the heavens, probably we understand in context this means that Christ is seated with some sense of duration on a heavenly throne. And all language serves that function. Language alone does not carry meaning. Language in context gives evidence of communicative intention. And we are constantly in everyday communication using whatever contextual information is available to remove the ambiguity from what people say. If we are sitting in the lounge together, let's say we're all having a home cell meeting, and Leilani says, sure, it's cold in here. What she may really mean is, Andrew, please will you close the window? And something about the context lets you get the message that she's not just trying to tell you she's a little bit cold, she's actually making a request, but her words don't constitute a request. So that's everyday communication. It's in writing, one tends to have to go more in the direction of letting your words be self-contained and explicit. But even so, context continually has to help to disambiguate nuances. And sometimes it doesn't, and that's why we end up with exegetical difficulties and differing interpretations and so on. So, a bit of philosophy of language usage. All of that to try and debunk the popular myth that once you learn Greek, all the doctrinal difficulties of the Bible are going to go away because Greek is so much more precise than English. Well, that's just not true. Okay? Katalambanite. Uperadzetai ho Jesus. Uperadzetai ho Jesus. Peraze ho diabolos ton. I could say ude perazetai ho Jesus. Leilani? Ti hermenue uperazetai ho Jesus.
Jesus is not tempted.
No. So it's moved to passive. Lege ho diabolo. Ukep arto mono zesetai ho anthropos. Ukep arto mono zesetai ho anthropos. Anybody? Ukep arto mono zesetai ho anthropos. This is the exact words of a portion of the story from Matthew's Gospel, I think.
Man will not live from bread alone.
On the basis of bread alone, eparto mono, uk zesetai ho anthropos.
Hello.
Gary.
Can you hear me now? That's a reboot.
We can hear you now. Welcome back.
Yeah, that man cannot live by bread alone, or on bread alone.
No, estin orthon. That is correct. Kalos eucharisto. Uke parto mono, zesetai ho anthropos. Ho anthropos, again, I probably pointed it out before, but the word anthropos would be inclusive. It's not referring to the male person, it's referring to human beings, even though it's normally translated man. If Greek wanted to refer specifically to a male man, it would use aner. Aner is always man, as in masculine, but anthropos is man as in human. Zesetai, anybody tell me the root word from which zesetai is derived? Zesetai. Pardon, Leilani?
Zeo, I live.
It's from zao. Zao, I live. What's interesting is that there are quite a few words, shame Gary's struggling to stay on, there are quite a few words that are normal in the present tense. Zao is one of them. You'll notice zao is just a regular word, I live. And when you use them in the future, they become deponent. Zesetai is one of them. So this is in form, zesetai is future middle. Can you see that? The etai ending would tell you this is a future middle, but it's active in meaning. Man will live. Man will live, not on bread alone. There are quite a few words that do that. They are active in the present tense, but deponent in the future. And the only way you know that is through exposure. Zesetai. He will live, it's an active sense.
Is there any specific reason for that? Because it just confuses things.
It does confuse things. Oh, that language, any language, would follow its own rules consistently. The sad thing about language is that grammar follows usage, and people tend not to follow the rules. So we end up with abnormalities because things creep into everyday usage which may not be exactly as the grammarian would write a hard and fast rule. And ironically, the more common something, or the more commonly something is used, the more likely it is to be irregular. The reason for that is obvious. If something is used rarely and it's irregular, people get confused. If you were a mother tongue speaker of a language and something is used very seldom and it's irregular, when you encounter it, you're going to struggle to recognize it. But if you use something every day, 1,000 times a day, it doesn't matter how irregular it is, you get used to it just through repeated use and familiarity. So sometimes there's no good theoretical reason why abnormalities exist in a language. They often exist because customary everyday usage has, for some or other not necessarily good reason, broken away from the conventional rule and then stuck. So if there's a better reason than that, I'm not sure what it is, but I think that often explains abnormalities. So you'll often find the most irregular words in any language, and it's true for Biblical Greek, the most irregular words are some of the most common words. Because they are common, they can survive being irregular, and you get to know them through usage. If you encountered this statement and you were trying to make sense of interpreting it or translating it, and you didn't know that zao, I live, is deponent in the future tense, you would scratch your head trying to figure out what does it mean here, because a middle voice doesn't seem to fit here. And when you scratch your head like that, it's always a good thing to go and check the lexicon. So if I share the lexicon with you quickly, let me just quickly go to Mounts and see if I can share his little... Okay, so I want to switch to... Is it that one? I think so. Okay, you should see Mounts' lexicon on your screen. First, you can see it.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay, it makes a fool of me, or rather I made a fool of myself, because Za'o is not dependent in the future. So what you have, that's your present tense, and then these are the other major tense forms, and they would tell you if a verb were dependent in a particular tense. So here's my future form, and it's not dependent. Zeso would be active. So Za'o is in fact not dependent. If I go to Ginosko, you'll see something interesting. Gnosko is active, but notice Gnosomai, which is the future, the third one in the list, Gnosomai is middle, the omai ending being the key here. So Gnosko is active in the present, but dependent in the future. Quite a few like that. I think our little friend Katalambano, another Katalambano, active in the present tense. Okay, they don't have him listed in the future, but he's a combination of kata and lambano. So if I go to lambano, which is a very common word, lambano is active in the present tense. It changes form, don't worry about that, but notice in the future the omai ending tells us it is dependent in the future. So Za'o, my present one, is apparently not dependent in the future. Which raises a question that I'll try to answer when I'm not with you. Okay, let's carry on. Pauline peraze ton Yesun. Anybody know Pauline?
Again?
Again, he tempts Jesus. Ehios e tu theu.
If you are the Son of God.
If you are the Son of God. I want to move forward. And again, Pauline peraze auton. Pasas tas basileas tu cosmu. Pasas basileas tu cosmu.
All the kingdoms of the world.
All the kingdoms of the world, doso soy, I will give to you. Pasas tas basileas tu cosmu. Doso soy. Satan says to Jesus, doso soy, pasas tas basileas tu cosmu. All the kingdoms of the world, if you will bow down and worship me. I think we're out of time, so I'm going to leave it there. There is a recording on my YouTube of the whole of this conversation, if anybody were interested. Let's move from there. But I'm going to call it a morning there. We've used that as an anchor to discuss some features of grammar and hopefully clarified some of the range of meaning and the imprecision of Greek at times. Andrew, did you find your text?
I did. Mark 7.
Mark 7, did you say?
Yeah, 31. Jesus heals a deaf man.
I inadvertently closed my Bible program, so I'm just reopening it. As soon as it's open, I'll go there.
Sure. So this is Jesus returns. Well, it says then he returned from the region of Tyre, which is obviously Jesus, and he went through Sidon. They brought to him a man, so obviously brought to Jesus, who was deaf and had a speech impediment. And they begged him, clearly Jesus, to lay his hand on him. So you can see all these hymns, and it's still talking about Jesus. Then taking him aside, so clearly now Jesus is taking the deaf man aside from the crowd privately. He put his fingers into his ears. So I picture now Jesus standing there with his fingers in his ears. But that's not what happened. Jesus put his fingers into the deaf man's ears. Now I get that from context I think. But why is there a way to say language-based that Jesus isn't standing there with his fingers in his own ears, and then and then he's spitting and touching his tongue. So he can't touch his tongue because his fingers in his ears. But just while I was reading that, I was saying, language is very weird again. You've got this his, and mentally I'm switching between his being Jesus and his being the man. I'm just wondering if Greek had a way to
read
make
the
it more explicit.
Read the NIV. It tells you he put his hands in the man's ears.
Yeah, but that's because they've made their own choice. So I am reading the ESV just so you know where I am, but clearly the English isn't specifically helping us, so I thought I'd just throw that out as a question.
I've shared an interlinear.
Okay.
Trust everyone can see it on my screen. Just click on my name if you can't. So Mark 7:31, Kai Palin, Exelthon, Ekton, Orion, Tiru. And again, having gone out of the region of Tyre, Elthen, Diasidonos, Esten Thalasan, Tes Galileas, Ano Meson, Ton Orion, Decapoleos. Is this the right verse?
Yeah, but go further down. Go to 33 to actually 34 is no 33. That's the one where it really.
That's where
and
it starts.
He took him away by himself. Put his fingers into his ears. So that's really, and it's using exactly the same Greek word there.
All right. So Kaiferusin auto, and they brought to him, obviously to Jesus, the antecedent being earlier in the narrative. It's not in our text. So Jesus is not mentioned in 31. Kai ferusin auto, kofon kai mogilalon, kai parakalusin auton, obviously still Jesus. So they brought, antecedent of auto earlier in the narrative is still clearly Jesus. To him, a man who was blind, blah, 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 and they were exhorting him. Same ambiguity in Greek as in English. The him, this him could be the man, but we understand clearly in context they were exhorting Jesus. How do we understand that? Hina epithei auto techeri. That he, in order that he would place his hand, auto, dative, upon him.
Sure.
In order that he would place his hand, not upon himself, obviously.
Sure,
so the auto is clearly pointing to the deaf man.
Okay.
Kai analabomenos, and having taken him. The one-word answer here, Andrew, is that in most of these instances you have the same ambiguity because the man and Jesus are both masculine singular. So the tendency of Greek to decline to indicate gender and case does not remove the ambiguities we feel in the English. And in Greek, one is still inferring only from context what each of these refer to.
Sure.
So to put his hand on him, we're inferring in context is kofon kai mogilalon, the man who was deaf and dumb, and having taken him away from the crowd. Again, we're inferring the same antecedent. So you're disambiguating the Greek exactly the same way, that you are the English.
Which explains why the NIV probably changed their language slightly, just to make it extra clear.
Well, that's the translation philosophy of the NIV.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Like I said, I didn't have it's not like I'm battling to understand the passage. It just, when all those hymns jumped out, I started to look at it and read it differently and realized that I can read it differently, and that just raised the question, was it any easier? That doesn't look like it is at all.
No, not in this case. Not in this case. It's the same, using the same principles of interpretation for the English as you are for the Greek all the way through here. There will be cases, though, in which in which Greek will have less ambiguity simply because of its ability to decline its pronouns to indicate gender and number, whereas English tends not to do that, at least not as often or as clearly. So there would be other contexts in which Greek might be less likely to have the same kind of ambiguity. What is not a reliable source is when you see a capital S for spirit, for instance, or a capital H for he. There are a few cases of this where there is significant potential for taking it either way. But some translations capitalize pronouns referring to deity and capitalize words like pneuma, spirit, when referring to the Holy Spirit, as opposed to, say, an evil spirit or the human spirit. The fact that it's capitalized in your English translation merely tells you that's how it's interpreted by the translator. And there are a few meaningful ambiguities there, especially relating to references to spirit, whether it's the Holy Spirit or a human spirit, and some relating to deity. There are places where it's unclear whether the he who did something is God or a person in context. And you cannot rely on capitals to tell you the answer, because the original text didn't use two different cases, upper and lower. Okay. Interesting. Anything else before we close?
Kevin?
Bugs.
Just a question in my mind. Yes, the fact that Greek is much less ambiguous than English, it was a bit of a shock to me, if I can put it that way, for finding that out. But what does give me a lot of comfort, I think, is the fact that if you understand the Greek, at least the ambiguities are where they should be, if I can put it that way. In English, you will find different ambiguities in places where it might not be in Greek, or you might find things that are not ambiguous that actually in the Greek is, that it has been interpreted in a certain way.
Very insightful comment, Bix. Absolutely. So ideally, in my opinion, a good translation should seek to retain the potential for ambiguity where it exists in Greek, and not to create additional ambiguities. Now that's a very, very difficult task, but I think at least philosophically, a good translation should be trying to leave open, if the Greek is permitting two reasonable interpretations, and one's choice is being made on context or based on your own doctrinal biases, ideally a translation should leave those same two potential interpretations open and not remove one or the other. It's not always possible. For instance, the fact that all English translations will put an uppercase S when referring to the Holy Spirit, or when taking a reference to pneuma to refer to the Holy Spirit, means that a translator does not have the option to sit on the fence. So when he's translating an occurrence of pneuma, he's either going to render it capital S or lowercase s, and his reader is going to take it as a reference to the Holy Spirit or the human spirit based on the choice that he makes. English does not permit him to retain the ambiguity there, and so he's forced to disambiguate the text on the basis of his own interpretation of that text. So there are cases when he can't, but whenever he can, in my opinion, the right translation philosophy should be to leave the same range of interpretations open from the translation that might have been available to a reader of the original text. Okay, I agree fully with your comment. What that means in terms of exegesis and doctrine and that kind of thing is, you know, it's naive to think that Greek will remove doctrinal ambiguities and answer all the questions that we have. It won't do that, but it will answer some. And it will remove some possibilities. There are some things that are sprouted which one simply would not find defensible based on Greek language and grammar, but it won't answer all of our differences of opinion. Carlos. Let's call it a day there.